Huntonji was very critical of ethnophilosophy. In other words, it can, in its worst incarnations, be a condescending practice of anthropologists going around Africa with these kind of liberal intentions and accumulating and documenting folklore and proverbs and idioms and other kinds of beliefs that they find in traditional societies, and then saying, this is genuine African philosophy and this is representative of African philosophy as a whole. Huntonji used this most remarkable expression. He called it the myth of primitive unanimity, which is basically this myth that Africa as a continent basically has one consensus with respect to questions of metaphysics, ethics, social and political philosophy, etc. He said, no, if we are going to grant the same dignity to African thought that we grant to Western thought, we will take all the ideas and be rigorous about them. And now we're moving towards the third decolonization, which is intellectual decolonization. I just want to show how neocolonialism can act as a bridging term between those two. Because when Kwame Nkrumah first began using the term, he was using it in the sense of economics and politics. He was talking about the extent to which Africa continued to be imprisoned by these economic forces that were established during the high season of colonialism. But by the 1970s and 1980s, neocolonialism turned out to be a remarkably protean, adaptive, or capacious term and was being used in many other contexts outside economics and politics. It was beginning to be used in the realm of culture. It was beginning to be used in the realm of psychology. In the 1970s and 1980s, African artists, critics, writers, intellectuals, theorists are taking up the term neocolonialism and using it to profitably analyze all the ways in which colonialism continues to cast a long shadow over the societies of Africa that goes well beyond economics and politics. You might discover here that neocolonialism is being used to speak about the relative prestige that's being granted to imperial languages as opposed to local languages. You might think about neocolonialism with respect to the continued infliction of certain kinds of Eurocentric beauty standards with respect to complexion, physiognomy, body type, etc., that are having a deleterious effect on people from these colonies who can't conform to these impossible standards of handsomeness and beauty. You might be thinking about neocolonialism with respect to education and curricula. The curriculum might be overwhelmingly skewed towards teaching theorists, writers that come from Europe and whose work captures the European experience at the relative neglect or marginalization of that rich cultural history that comes from Africa and in which has produced dozens and hundreds of writers and artists and musicians and so on and so forth. And then you also might be thinking about neocolonialism with respect to the type of history that's being taught in Africa. So for a long time, the history that was taught in Africa in the late 20th century was one that had been deformed by all kinds of colonialist historiographical presuppositions about what did Africa look like in the past. Was Africa a heart of darkness? Was Africa a place that had its own civilization or not? And so in that sense, neocolonialism is referring to all of those distortions that continue to operate in the realm of language, of culture, of psychology, and so on and so forth. So now I would mark the need to respond to those type of distortions as a third and final type of decolonization, which we might call intellectual decolonization. And here I would say that in Africa, in the 1980s, you've got a very strong reaction taking place from scholars, intellectuals, and artists, which is broadly taking place under the banner of what you might call decolonizing the mind. In 1986, the Kenyan novelist and Marxist academic Ngũgĩ Thiong'o published a collection of essays called Decolonizing the Mind. In 1987, the Nigerian scholar whose name I have already mentioned, Chinwezu, published a collection of very provocative essays called Decolonizing the African Mind. And then there's just no shortage of examples that one can give of writers who are now fighting back against the intellectual legacies of colonialism and aiming to respond to these distortions and counter it by showing that Africa does have a very illustrious history that's as complex as anywhere else on earth, that Africa does have its own traditions and its own civilizations, that there is something Eurocentric about a lot of these forms of history or education that are being circulated in the continent. I also wanted to mention here the Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, who is globally renowned, Oxford educated intellectual, and I think who even these days writes a column for The Guardian in the United Kingdom. In 1993, he published a marvelous memoir and intellectual work called In My Father's House. And in that book, he was saying that we need to perform what he called an ideological decolonization on Pan-Africanism. So he was suggesting that even some of the responses that had arisen to counter and combat the colonialism of the mind themselves needed to be subjected to decolonization. And that's because some of those discourses had been infiltrated by colonial ideas. So, with respect to Pan Africanism, he wrote that an archaeology of Pan Africanism's ideas of race can help guard against false assumptions of cultural homogeneity. He said that the idea of an African race is grounded in bad biological and worse ethical ideas inherited from the increasingly racialized thought of 19th century Europe and America. So, what's important to say there is if decolonization in its broadest possible sense means the attempt to undo distortions or injustices or asymmetries in power that are brought about by the colonial encounter, then it's not simply ideas that come from the West that we need to be rigorous about. It's also the ways in which African scholars, artists, and thinkers themselves have responded to those discourses, because some of them themselves may contain elements of those colonial distortions. Okay, lastly, with respect to intellectual decolonization, and this is the last point I wanted to make here, was just to give you the briefest survey of some ways in which one can make sense of what intellectual decolonization looks like in Africa, some of the traditions that go back to the 70s and 80s, to show that this is absolutely not a new idea in African discourse. Even though we now might be living through a time in which one can't walk across any university campus without seeing posters for a seminar saying, decolonize this, decolonize that. So there certainly is a resurgence in the popularity of this decolonization trope. I think we should not fall prey to an amnesia which suggests that this is the first time that formerly colonized peoples are beginning to grapple with the legacy of colonialism. There is a rich, vast, complicated, variegated archive of thought on the subject of intellectual decolonization in Africa. And I'm going to start by just flagging 3 points with respect to this. Number one, let's talk about the Ghanaian philosopher Kwasi Wiredu. Now, as far back as the 1980s, Kwasi Wiredu was championing an idea which he called conceptual decolonization. What does he mean by this? He wrote that to decolonize our philosophical thinking means, and I quote, divesting our thought of all undue influences emanating from the modes of thought of our erstwhile colonizers. So, in other words, to decolonize our thinking means, whether through force of habit or whether through ideological programming or whether through the caprices of colonial education, certain ideas have come into African thinking and come into African philosophical thinking, and they may be distortions that are colonial in origin. They may be Eurocentric, they may be wrong, they may be unhelpful, they may be destructive. If that's the case, we must perform an intellectual audit in which we inventory all the ideas that have come to Africa from colonialism, look at each one, subject to it to analysis, critical thinking, rigor, and say, is this idea right or wrong? Is it useful or not? And if it passes the test, then we can say, okay, fine, this is an idea that's worth holding on to. So the important thing is that he uses the term undue influence. It is not amounting to a wholesale rejection of all ideas that come from the West. It is saying which ideas are wrong. We will use other metrics to determine whether or not an idea is wrong or useful. We're not going to use the idea of does it come from the West? It's not the origin that's going to determine whether or not it's undue. So yes, it is the case that an extraordinary amount of ideas which came through the colonial counter were distortions. It is the case that there was an extraordinary amount of racism and all kinds of other deleterious thinking that was introduced into the continent. So Kwasi Wiredu says, yes, and I embrace the idea. Let's decolonize our philosophical thinking. I also wanted to make clear that Wiredu had two ideas of conceptual decolonization. He spoke of a positive decolonization and a negative decolonization. The negative one means taking ideas from the West, subjecting them to scrutiny and saying, are they good or bad? But the positive one means bringing back into the conversation a whole diversity of thought from Africa that was unjustly suppressed or marginalized during the colonial encounter. Again, it is no secret that many of the colonial forces would come to Africa on account of their prejudice and their bias and their racism, would look at certain ways of African social organization, beliefs, values, ideas, whatever the case might be, and say, this does not rise to the level of knowledge. This should be pushed aside. It should be discounted as irrationality, myth, superstition. Remember a lot of the colonial enterprise, which was conducted under conditions of inveterate racism, would go as far as to say, this thinking that's coming from these African societies, this is savagery, this is barbarism, this belongs to the infancy of the species. And so on that basis, they would banish the idea and it would not be allowed to enter into the dialogue. So that's Wiredu's second point. Bring the ideas that have been unjustly marginalized, bring them back. Let's talk about them. But importantly, in Wiredu, it is the case that one should be rigorous, critical, and exercise the same level of analytic rigor with respect to ideas, whether they come from the West or whether they come from Africa. It's just not a recipe for saying reject everything from the West and bring everything from Africa back into play. That would be completely facile. So that's my first one of three, was Kwasi Wiredu. I find him a great pleasure to read. His writing is full of clarity and elegance and economy of thought. If your readers are interested in knowing about the history of intellectual decolonization in Africa, they could do far worse than to begin with the writings of Kwasi Wiredu. Second, let's talk about the philosopher from Benin, Pauline Huntonji. Huntonji and Wiredu were actually working together for UNESCO in the 1980s, where they were doing research into how best to teach philosophy in Africa. There are these kind of remarkable volumes of their investigations that were published in the 1980s, but they had the goals of decolonizing education, producing curricula and training educators in African philosophy, making African philosophical traditions more prominent by bringing them into the global conversation. And importantly, and this is so important, not just insulating African philosophy so that it's only a conversation being taken place between Africans, but bringing it onto the global stage so that we as a species can equally share in the riches of insight that come from all parts of the world. Now, Huntonji was very critical of ethno-philosophy. In other words, it can, in its worst incarnations, be a condescending practice of anthropologists going around Africa with these kind of liberal intentions and accumulating and documenting folklore and proverbs and idioms and other kinds of beliefs that they find in traditional societies, and then saying, this is genuine African philosophy and this is representative of African philosophy as a whole. Huntonji used this most remarkable expression. He called it the myth of primitive unanimity, which is basically this myth that Africa as a continent basically has one consensus with respect to questions of metaphysics, ethics, social and political philosophy, etc. He said, no, if we are going to grant the same dignity to African thought that we grant to Western thought, we will take all the ideas and be rigorous about them. And we will be willing to dismiss them if they don't meet the standards that we require of other traditions of philosophical thought. this will enrich our philosophy, and this will make it more powerful and more useful to people as an instrument through which they can interpret their world and can make sense of what's happening to them and empower themselves with respect to whatever injustices it is that they face, whether in their personal life or at a political level. So Huntonji believes that philosophy is a universal discipline, and therefore believes that, like with Wiredu, that it is quite ennobling, or let's say dignifying, to treat these philosophical traditions with scrutiny and be willing to criticize them. Okay, so that's Kwasi Wiredu, that's Paul Huntonji. I've already mentioned Kwame Anthony Appiah. I won't go into too much detail about him because I think he's a very renowned scholar internationally, but his work In My Father's House is a landmark text in intellectual decolonization. Absolutely worth a read, beautifully written. And it really just gives you a sense of the extraordinary and progressive work that has been done in Africa on this question, going back now, this is 30 years ago. Thirdly, I just wanted to mention that it's not only the case that this kind of work was being done in the traditions of the social sciences or philosophy, because Africa has produced a most remarkable archive of novelists, writers, poets, and those working in the imaginative traditions who have also grappled with the question of intellectual decolonization. So I just wanted to mention some of them so that your audience, if they want to explore this further, has got a sense of people who they can look up. Chinua Achebe was not only one of the grandfathers of African literature, but also a man who wrote extensively as a scholar, as a writer of nonfiction. A collection of his, Morning Yet on Creation Day, is quite a celebrated work. Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o is not only renowned for all of the extraordinary works of fiction that he did, but also works like Decolonizing the Mind, Secure the Base, Moving the Center, Globalectics. For decades, he's been addressing this question of Africa's place within the global intellectual economy. I'm an enormous fan of the writings of the Ghanaian writer Aikwe Armah, who in the late 60s and early 70s was writing novels like The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, Fragments, Why Are We So Blessed? I would say that in the 1970s, he produced some of the most experimental works of fiction that are absolutely worth reading. I'm thinking here of a novel of his called 2000 Seasons. Now, regrettably, it is so difficult to get hold of a copy of this book, which has been out of print for decades, but if any one of your readers comes across a copy of 2000 Seasons at a secondhand bookstore, my advice to you is snap up a copy. You've got Bessie Head, Tsitsi Dangaremba, Osman Sembene, and then I'd also like to make a special honorable mention to one of my favorite novels. This is published in the 1970s by the highly reclusive Malian writer Yambo Ulagem. It's called Bound to Violence, and it is one of the most hallucinatory, provocative pieces of literature I've ever read. So what I'm suggesting to you here is, yes, intellectual decolonization has been championed by such a diversity of thinkers in Africa. It is by no means something that's new on the scene, and one should not fall into the trap of the myth of primitive unanimity by thinking that Africans share one vision of how to accomplish intellectual decolonization. Wiredu, Huntonji, Chinwetu, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, all these writers that I've mentioned, each one of them might have a unique way of looking at the problem. But I fully agree with the idea that we should circulate the works of these thinkers more extensively than has been done and engage with their work. And what we love about them, yes, let's enjoy that. But we should also be willing to be critical about them. They are not messiahs who just have the answer to everything. And a lot of their work can be highly controversial.